For neuropsychological batteries, the reason I love Neuropsych is it breaks it down by functional area. You look at intelligence, you look at achievement, and then I go into specific brain functions. So I'm looking at visual spatial, I'm looking at motor, I'm looking at language, I'm looking at memory, I'm looking at executive function, and I do social. I also personally separate out, even though it's a component of executive function, in my reports, the first section of my report after the clinical history is on attention. Why? If you're not paying attention, all bets are off. All the other scores that you're going to get are going to be skewed downward most of the time. Or you're going to see a pattern that's very inconsistent. The hallmark of inattention, which is much harder to diagnose than attentiveness, which attentional issues, for example, when you start to talk about, Bonnie, how do you distinguish social anxiety from autism? One of the things that you start to look for is if they're inattentiveness, social anxiety and anxiety disorders go comorbidly with inattentiveness, okay? And that looks, especially in girls, much different than the child running around getting up out of their chair. Inattentiveness looks like an inconsistent pattern on the test of variable attention, okay? So let me give, I didn't write them down here, but one of the things I would add is for attention, I give the Connors rating scales. So I'm getting a teacher and parent report. I look at the scores on the BASC, the Behavioral Assessment Scale for Children, and I look at something like the CPT, the continuous performance test that I give in my office, or the TOVA, the test of variable attention. So, you know, somebody asks me, would you give my child just an ADHD battery? I tend to not do it because you can't rule out a lot of other things. Not because I like to charge people more money. I just don't find it, it's really scary to me to just test one function given how they all come together. So attention is the first portion of my report. IQ and achievement, again, after RTI came into vein, a lot of state laws don't require you to use only IQ anymore to qualify a child for services. So on the East Coast in particular, I've seen it less so out here. I've seen people go to giving just portions of a battery because of time concerns. Again, I get really concerned if I'm just testing one area without looking at how they all integrate. For visual spatial, I give the Hooper, which is a test where a shape is all cut up and rearranged and the child has to rearrange the shapes. I give the judgmental line orientation. Sometimes I'll give a face perception test. Sometimes, and always, I give the Beery visual. The Beery I love because it has 3 components, although when the latest norming happened, I found kids have to do really poorly to do bad on the Beery. I don't know what happened in the most recent norming, but I'm finding kids aren't doing, it's not as subtle as it used to be. Yeah?
Which facial exam do you use?
It's the face perception test, it's called. Yeah. But the Beery visual, the thing I love about it is it gives a visual spatial portion. It gives a combined test, so you get visual spatial and motor combined, and then it teases it out in just a motor component and just a visual spatial component. Because then, that's really helpful, right? So if you have a child that can't copy figures in class, you don't know if it's because of motor or visual spatial. And especially for younger kids at the 3, 4, 5 age range, really important thing to look at. So you need to be able to tease that out. So it has 3 components. Most people give just the combined. I give all 3. Motor, I give the Beery portion of the motor test and the pegboard. There's also a motor component of the Dellis-Kaplan executive function battery that I give. Start to notice a pattern. I always give within each domain 2 to 3 tests. I'm never giving just one test in a domain, because you never know if it was just a function of that test or the child didn't do well on that test. I'm always looking to sort of internally validate a hypothesis. Language, I love the comprehensive assessment of spoken language. It's my favorite language test. Not most commonly used by speech folks. So to go back to your question about sort of, do I ask parents, to look at prior reports. If I find out that they're going to go to a speech and language pathologist, sometimes I'm more careful about how much of this I give, and I just give portions of it and don't give the whole test and let a speech person give the whole battery. I oftentimes give the Boston naming test, but the norms for the littler kids on BNT are not great. BNT is better for stroke patients and older adults. Not elders, but adults who are older. Bless you. Memory, I give the Children's Verbal Learning Test. Love that test. It gives you a learning curve. It gives you, whether it's a problem with retrieval in memory, whether it's a problem with actual memory, it's just a great test. Children's Memory Scale, I also give that for nonverbal memory, so I'm looking at both aspects. Executive function, I give the Dellis-Kaplan Executive Function Battery, and I love the Ray. I love the Ray. The Ray, I get more from that test. If I have to give, I developed a small mini Neuropsych screening battery. I got more bang from the buck from that test. I've got 250 batteries I'm looking at with little kids on the Ray. Amazing test. The social, I give the Basque, and then some of the others we talked about today, for if they're really having a social. If the child, I'm worried in a forensic context, or I'm worried about a mood disorder, or I can't figure it out, I will go to a Rorschach. I will also go to the MAPI. Love the MAPI for kids. Or the Mackey, the Milan inventories. So that's where I start to go if I'm worried about something more severe. There really isn't good neuropsych screener.
What about the brief? Isn't that what's called?
That's the behavior rating inventory. We're going to look at some data that I use that on my dissertation, the behavior rating inventory of executive function. Okay. And I love Jerry. I love Jerry. He's at Children's in DC, and it's a great concept, and it fits with parents' experience. But it's, with the exception of some of the ADHD studies that Mark Mahone has come out with from Johns Hopkins. Mark has published pretty extensively, and I want to say in Tourette's, whoever asked about Tourette's, but I could be wrong, yeah. Mark has validated the behavior rating inventory of executive function. I've not found that it ties with actual executive impairments on the Dellis-Kaplan in the populations I've tested. And I didn't find that it had any tie, and again, a negative finding doesn't mean anything, but it does at some level. It didn't have any relation to actual executive function impairments in my dissertation.
Do you like the decaf better than you do the Neuropsych? Why?
Why? You know, I think the Neuropsych, the tower test I actually gave on my dissertation. And I think the tower test is pretty incredible. I think what happens in norming tests sometimes, and I'm probably too close to the Neuropsych, so I know it's bugaboos. I found that the Neuropsych, for example, when you do the tower test, if you have an ADHD kid on the tower test, they're grabbing the balls, throwing with them, playing them in the air. Does anybody else give the Neuropsych? And they're violating the move rule for 15 different reasons. It's not an executive function test then. They missed it because of attention. The 2 or 3 move rule I found to be incredibly helpful, and in fact we're going to look at data that I found that show that actually how kids did on the Neuropsych tower absolutely correlated with social deficits. And so there's a certain aspect of executive function it picks up that I liked. Some of the other aspects of the Neuropsych, the executive function component, have really not played out in the literature. Executive function in kids, I don't think it's a function. All these people did great tests. I think part of the issue is we don't understand completely executive function in kids yet. I mean, we used to think that kids below 6, it really wasn't in yet. If you're seeing a child in foster care for 2 years with poor attachment, or whose mom was bipolar, or an Axis 2 diagnosis, how does executive function ever get internalized? What is executive function? Well, executive function is The parent is the executive function, tells us when to stop, when to start, how to plan, teaches that. Over time, that comes in online. So aspects of that have to develop. Kim Espy out of Oklahoma is doing some really great research on trying to look at executive function in little kids under 6. There's absolutely components of self-control. You know, starting with self-control, which is really key, which is what you learn from mom and dad, but what happens when mom and dad aren't there? How does it come online? How much of it is innate? I don't think we understand it yet, so I don't think we have good tests yet to measure it. And so that's why I think a lot of the tests, like the brief and what have you, yeah, does a kid clean their room? That could be executive function, or it could be a lot of other things. And so they're not sensitive or specific enough yet to how executive function develops because we don't have a good model. I don't screen on the Neuropsych. The only reason I did a screen on the Neuropsych, and we can talk about a little more about what I chose to use for a screen, when I do a Neuropsych screen, I'm still looking at every area using some of the same tests, but just smaller amounts of tests. So I went to, I don't give an IQ. I went to a reading test, a math test.
Okay.
I went to the RAY, which will give me a visual spatial measure and a memory measure. I went to a sentence memory test, and I went to the BESS, and I went to the social communication questionnaire. If I only have time for a screening battery, on the Neuropsych side, that's what I use. For my screening that I put online on Skip, I do the BESS. The BESS is correlated with reading scores in 3rd graders. Oh my gosh, for 35 questions, the social communication questionnaire, because I gotta pick up autism, and the BESS isn't specifically written for just autism. So those are the 2 screeners I start with on a large population. And that you can even go on my website, and I'll give you guys free uses. This isn't about me making money. You know, the more people I can give those 2 instruments to, the better. Okay, all the way up to 18 to 21. I'm using the BESS and the social communication questionnaire for absolute screeners. If they fail on those screeners, then I start to go into these larger batteries. The Neuropsych battery is rarely paid for by insurance, unless a child has epilepsy or some other neurological issue. So this is mostly private pay, very rarely. And they very rarely will pay for an attachment eval, which is so necessary in looking at things like reactive attachment disorder, because they're just now starting to recognize 0 to 5 actually has issues. There's Helen Egger out of the East Coast, out of North Carolina, has developed an algorithm for kids under 5 and a diagnostic tool that is really great. You have to go there and train. I've gone there and trained on it. It's really excellent.